Chapter 7, Blood Screencast 2. Now, the first screencast was an introduction to the cardiovascular system and blood in general. This screencast is focusing on the formed elements. So we'll be talking about erythrocytes, red blood cells, leukocytes, white blood cells, and platelets. Together, they are the formed elements that make up blood. Now, the primary job of red blood cells is transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and primarily oxygen. As we saw in the previous screencast, red blood cells account for about 45% of total blood volume. And as I said, their job is oxygen transport primarily. They will transport some CO2, but really it's about oxygen. The protein that allows red blood cells to transport oxygen as effectively as it does is hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin is a complicated molecule. We'll take a look at it in just a second. And the part that actually binds with oxygen is heme, and that's actually made up of iron. Now, our red blood cells actually are formed in the bone marrow, and we'll actually see a diagram a little bit later that talks about the formation of red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. One thing that is important to keep in mind here is the typical lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days. And we'll talk about some other characteristics. One thing you want to take a note here is physically, quite often, they're described as a biconcave disc. Another characteristic of the red blood cells is they lack all organelles primarily. I quite often will refer to a red blood cell as a bag of hemoglobin because that's really what its job. There's no nucleus, no mitochondria, and also missing some of the other organelles we expect to find in cells. So quite often, in the technical term of things, red blood cells really aren't a cell because they are lacking a number of those organelles overall. Now, there's also a hormone that is responsible for controlling the production of red blood cells, and that protein is erythropoietin, usually abbreviated as EPO. Here is that hemoglobin molecule. And remember when we talked about proteins, proteins had at least 3 levels of structure, and some proteins actually had a 4th level. This is the best example of a protein that has that 4th or quaternary level of structure, and it can only happen when you have proteins that are made up of multiple polypeptide chains, and that's what we see with hemoglobin. Here, this is actually the heme group, and that's where the iron is, and that is actually the part of the hemoglobin molecule that is responsible for oxygen transport. The other thing we want to remember here is the transport with oxygen is reversible. So hemoglobin can pick up oxygen and it also releases it. Now, you may have heard of the terms hematocrit, and generally it really is reflective of the oxygen carrying capacity of blood. Hematocrit is classified as the percentage of whole blood that consists of red blood cells. And here we're going to see a pretty major difference between males and females. The hematocrit typically in men runs from 43 to 49%, and women 37 to 43%. One of the reasons why we see such a big difference is testosterone. So testosterone is one of the reasons why males will have a higher hematocrit. Generally, if you look at the hemoglobin measurement, this is not something that you see very regularly, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Okay. Now, when someone is told that they have a low hematocrit or low hemoglobin levels, this is probably an indication of anemia. And anemia is a general term used to describe decreased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. Now, one of the most common types of anemia is iron deficiency anemia. And now I think you can actually put that together why iron is important. Iron makes up hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is responsible for oxygen transport. So hopefully you can put that together. Now, a higher hematocrit, that might be the body's response to altitude. So your body is actually producing more red blood cells. Now, having a high hematocrit is actually quite dangerous because what that does, that increases the blood viscosity, and that can actually be a problem. Now here, what we're looking at is basically where all of the formed elements are produced, and it's within red bone marrow. So there's these stem cells that basically are the precursors for all of the formed elements. So here we can see the precursor to red blood cells. Here we see the precursor to what we refer to as granular white blood cells. Here we see the precursor to the agranular, and then also the precursor to megakaryocytes. Okay, so these stem cells actually differentiate into these lines here, and then we actually see the development of the cells overall. Here I'm going to spend a little time just kind of showing you what's happening with the red blood cell, because notice you've got the erythroblast evolving from the stem cell, and as it becomes a mature red blood cell, you can see the loss of the nucleus. All right, remember we kind of characterized that earlier. Another thing I want to point out here is when we talk about platelets, platelets are quite often better referred to as a cell fragment. Okay? And these are our primary white blood cells. Now, immature red blood cells are called erythroblasts. And as noted in the previous slide, this transformation into red blood cells occurs within red bone marrow. And so as they're maturing and developing, these erythroblasts actually fill up with hemoglobin and then mature into red blood cells. And as noted before, prior to being released, they lose their nucleus and other organelles. The lifespan of a red blood cell is about 120 days. Now, what our body does, it basically recycles the components, and that process is actually done within the liver and the spleen. Okay, so that's where that process is happening, and pretty much almost all of the components are recycled. The only thing that is not recycled is the non-heme portion of hemoglobin, and that actually is transferred into bilirubin and eliminated from the body. Now here, this is the negative feedback mechanism that's responsible for red blood cell production. So notice what we're looking at here, oxygen availability. And so there is a set point for this. Now, let's say you imagine that you are spending time at altitude. Altitude, there is less oxygen, and one of the adaptations the body makes for individuals when they're at altitude is to produce more red blood cells. So let's take a look at this particular mechanism. So here we can actually see a decrease, okay? And we have cells within the kidneys that are sensitive to the concentration of oxygen, and when oxygen levels decline, this is actually going to tell the kidneys to produce erythropoietin, or EPO. Now, what EPO is going to do, that's basically going to stimulate the red blood cell production within the bone marrow. So now you're actually going to produce more red blood cells, and hopefully this is going to result in a greater capacity to transport oxygen, and will bring oxygen levels back to where they're supposed to be. Now, white blood cells, or leukocytes, they actually are preventative in nature, and their primary role is going to be in immunity. As noticed before, they arise from stem cells within the red bone marrow. They're, in comparison to red blood cells, white blood cells only make up 1% of whole blood. Now, when we look at the primary functions, prevention or protecting us from infections, and also they're primary regulators of the inflammatory process that takes place within our body. Now, there's two major categories of these leukocytes or white blood cells. Some are called granular, and those are neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And then there's two that are agranular. Those are the lymphocytes and monocytes. One of the questions I ask pretty regularly is to place the white blood cells in what we have the most of, to the least. So here, it doesn't matter if they're granular or agranular, and you can use the mnemonic device, never let monkeys eat bananas. So we have neutrophils, okay, that's what we have the most, never. Lymphocytes, let. Then we have monocytes, there's our monkeys. Eosinophils, eat. And then what we have the least are basophils, and there's the bananas. So that's generally how we list them, from what we have the most of to the least. So once again, that's neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Now, the other characteristic about our white blood cells is that they have a relatively short lifespan, but you can see an increase in the number of white blood cells, especially in response to an infection. Now, as noted, neutrophils account for the majority of circulating white blood cells. And generally, they're going to be the first on scene to fight infection. And they actually function through phagocytosis. So they kind of act like little Pac-Man, and they kind of gobble up these pathogens and things that don't belong in the body. We have the eosinophils. This accounts for 2 to 4% of circulating white blood cells. These are kind of like my favorite because I like the fact that they defend against large parasites or worms. Now, the other role that they might play is with regards to moderating the severity of allergic reactions. Now, basophils, this is the least of all of the white blood cells, and they actually have these granules in the cytoplasm which contain histamine. And histamine plays a really important role in the inflammatory response and allergic reactions. Now, monocytes, this counts for about 5% of circulating white blood cells, and their job is primarily to leave the blood, and they're going to transform into macrophages. And what they are responsible for, once again, they will attack pathogens through phagocytosis. Then we have lymphocytes. These are especially important when we're talking about what's known as cell-mediated immunity. And there are two types of lymphocytes. We have B lymphocytes or B cells, and then we have T lymphocytes or T cells. We're going to come back to this and talk about them a little bit later when we do the immune system. Now, platelets, as I said before, they're basically cell fragments. And once again, as the other formed elements, they are arising from stem cells within red bone marrow. They actually form eventually from these megakaryocytes. And what happens, they break into fragments within the bone marrow, then they're released. Now, platelets play an important role in the process of hemostasis, and that's actually going to be covered in the next screencast. So if a blood vessel is injured, platelets are actually going to form what we call a plug. Okay? And they also can initiate the clotting process. I do not want you to confuse a platelet plug with the clot because they're not the same thing. Okay? And platelets also will play a role in the repair process.